So I have over 30 years of teaching experience, probably more than some of you have years on this earth. And I have 11 years as the director of the intensive English program at Northern Arizona University. So let's get started. Our overview of the presentation is we're going to take a little bit of time to look at rote versus engaged practice. And then we're going to look at a lot of different types of activities that we can use for presenting vocabulary, for having fun with grammar charts. That might sound like an impossible task, but hopefully at the end of this presentation, you'll have some ideas that you can do with grammar charts that would be fun. Then we'll also look at grammar in context and across a range of skills. I think it's really important for us to think about all the different skills and ways that we can use grammar. And then we'll wrap up with an overview again, reviewing some things very quickly, and then have some time for questions. So as was mentioned, if you have questions, you can put them in this chat box, and people will be collecting some of those so that I can see them. So even if you were to write it at the beginning of the presentation, I would still see your question because the folks at Cambridge are in charge. So they're on the East Coast, I'm on the West Coast, and here we go. So rote versus engaged practice. I think as we look at these two pictures, and as teachers, we're constantly looking out in our classrooms. When I look at the picture on the left, it's a pretty discouraging picture. And to me, that's what can happen in a classroom that just is engaged in rote learning and rote practice. Whereas on the right-hand side, the students look happy, they're raising their hands, they seem engaged, they're interested in what's going on. So how do we create these two different classrooms? I also hope that none of us are teaching in a room like the one on the left, because that's hard right there to create an environment for engaged practice. But I think even in that kind of a physical context, we can do activities that can engage our learners and prevent them from falling asleep like these guys in the first few rows. So to think about rote and engaged practice, excuse me. Rote practice is when we have drills with no purpose or context. It's just kind of what I think of as drill and kill. So it's just drilling something, and we don't, as a teacher, it's boring for us. And as our students, it's even more boring because they don't see the purpose, it's not in a context, and they're just mechanically completing the tasks. It's like, I have to do this, the teacher says to do this, I'm going to do this, but I really don't know why. Whereas in engaged practice, there's a goal. We're explaining why we're doing something. We're explaining to students what we're expecting them to learn, why we're involved in this practice, and also the context of use. How are they going to use it? And also students are then engaged with engaged practice. Students are thinking, they're problem solving. We're giving them recognition and respect. We're saying, we know you're smart, and we're going to have you actively involved in learning. And that's what engaged practice is all about. So the challenge for us is, how do we make grammar practice engaging? Because we have to cover so many skills and purposes. And as grammar teachers, we also have to provide quite a bit of practice and repetition, but it should be meaningful, and as often as possible, students should be problem solving, and also it should be fun sometimes. So as I mentioned in the first slide in the overview, we're going to start with vocabulary, and we're going to look at how we can practice vocabulary, because vocabulary and grammar, as I've always said, those of you who have heard me before, you know I see this very, very intimate relationship between vocabulary and grammar. And so we have to think of clever ways to do this. So let's look at one of my favorite activities for practicing vocabulary and also practicing grammar. So I call this vocabulary Tic Tac Toe. And I'm going to try to highlight some things that we can practice with Tic Tac Toe, and then I'll show you a very explicit example. So At a beginning level, this can be a nice way to practice the vocabulary in a unit, or that students will be needing for reading, pre-teaching vocabulary, practicing it. We can practice irregular plural nouns. We can practice irregular verbs. And we could also, of course, practice the regular ones of nouns and verbs, but the irregular ones usually need a little bit more practice than the regular ones. So this is a fun way to do this. And this is for a beginning level. At an advanced level, we can use the same game, if you will, of tic tac toe and practice chunks of language. We can practice, for example, adjective preposition combinations, or we could practice common occurring clusters. We could practice prepositions that go with phrases like instead of or things like that. We can also practice changing verbs to nouns. And you might be thinking, well, why in the world would I want to change a verb to a noun? Well, the reason is that when we get into more academic writing, as we move more from sort of personal writing or conversation to more academic writing tasks, we use a lot more nouns than verbs. And so students need to understand that instead of saying, I want to argue blah, 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 they would want to say the argument is. So they're changing the verb argue into argument. And so act and action, so thinking about that. So this could be a fun way to practice. And again, this is purposeful grammar. This is, contextualized. We're talking about why we're doing it. So let's look at an example of how to do this. And we'll do it at a beginning level, looking at past tense verbs. So this is tic tac toe for past tense verbs. So in this, the way that I play this often is I will give my students a list of the 15 most common verbs. Again, this is purposeful. I didn't just say, I wonder what verbs would be fun for my students to learn. I know from research that these 15 verbs are very, very frequent. They're common. Students are going to be meeting these verbs as they speak, as they read, as they listen, as they hear things, as they write. They're going to have to control these verbs. So I've picked these 15 verbs from research, and I'm going to ask my students to put 9 of them in these squares here. And I'm asking them to write the base form, so exactly what they're seeing here in the box. And the other thing about this activity is in order to win, you have to have 3 boxes in a row. So even just this game can practice vocabulary, because you can say, oh, I have 3 across, or I have 3 up and down, or I have 3 going, side to side. So side to side, up and down, and across. Or with more advanced students, you could talk about it being horizontal, vertical, or diagonal. So even this simple activity can introduce more vocabulary. So as we look at this, here's some ways that are some tips for teaching and using this activity. So the students are going to have different verbs on their board because there are only 9 squares, right? And we've given them 15 verbs. So students are making individual choices about verbs they either feel confident about or verbs that they want to practice. The other nice thing is not everybody's tic-tac-toe board is going to look the same. The teacher is then going to call out the past tense form of one of the verbs, and the student has to mark and identify the base form that's written on their tic-tac-toe board. So this takes a little bit of thinking here. And when the student says, I won, they need to confirm that they mark the correct verbs. And you can do this in a couple ways. The teacher could check. That would be quick and easy and not that much fun. But you could also have classmates listen. So the teacher could recall out the past tense form, and the student who has the winning card or thinks he has the winning card will call out the base form, and the classmates can listen and vote if the student was correct or not. So this way, everyone is engaged in this activity. You could have a variation where, of course, the students would have the past tense form written down and the teacher uses the base form. You can also do this where the students have the role of the caller. So the student is the one in charge. And I think, this is a game that's very engaging. It's a fun way to practice. It's a nice way to break it up. And you can do this game very easily with lots of different activities, like lots of different forms, if you will, or vocabulary, as I mentioned earlier. This is one of these things that I call a sponge activity. So maybe you've taught your lesson and you think, oh, I could use a little bit more engaged activity. My students are looking a little tired. You can just pop this activity in very easily. It's not hard. Students can draw the boards. Now we're going to look at two examples of charts. So I think many times, and especially, well, in grammar classes, we have this pattern of we introduce something, we kind of get the idea going about the form we're going to be looking at, and then we have these charts. And many times the students just see these charts as like, oh my gosh, we're going to talk through this chart, and it is not very exciting and it's not very boring. I mean, it is very boring. It's not very engaged. And so I would like to give you two ideas, two example activities that can help grammar charts be more fun, more engaged, have students more motivated. So this first activity I call Become an Expert. And I'm going to actually show you this activity just like I showed you with the Tic Tac Toe after I explain it. So in this case, you're going to make a copy of the grammar chart that you're teaching or reviewing. And I think this is another point I want to make sure. We have so little time with our students. Even if they're in an intensive program, there's so little class time compared to all the things we have to teach that we want to make sure we're maximizing the time to teach. So sometimes it's worth finding out if the students already are pretty good with this structure and just need practice in different contexts, then let's do that rather than marching through the textbook line by line. So in this case, you make a copy of the grammar chart. You'll have to make probably one or two copies, and you're going to cut that chart up into sections. That's why we want you making a copy. Don't want you cutting up the books. And as the students come into class, you're going to hand them a piece of the chart. And you'll see this in the next slide. I'll demonstrate how to do this. And then when the class, so each student, as they're walking into the room, so you're there early, you're a good teacher, you're in class early, and as students are coming into the room, you're handing them pieces of the chart. And then as the class, to start the class, you have the students move around and try to find the partner for that half of the chart. And now those two students or that group of four students will be the experts on that portion of the chart. They have ownership. So here's an example looking at plural nouns. So here we have a part of the chart. So we have on the left-hand side the form and on the right-hand side the examples. So as the teacher, you're going to make a copy of this chart and you're going to then cut it up. You're going to cut it up so that we have these 8 sections. And as the student walks into the room, you hand them this section. The next student walks in, you hand them another section. Maybe you hand them this section. Now, probably most of you have more than 8 students in your classes. It's sad, but I mean, it's good for your programs, but sad if you have a large class. But you can obviously do this maybe with a couple charts at the same time if you're reviewing something, or if this is new, you can make multiple copies of this so that students would actually be in teams. And so the students, for example, that would be, hopefully they would find each other, they would look at this, they walk around and ask their friends, which example. So if you have the first one, add S to most singular nouns to form plural nouns. If this is the piece that you have to go around and find the person that matches this on the right-hand side. And then that becomes your buddy. The two of you are the experts. This is at a very simple level. This is at maybe a beginning, high beginner level, or maybe low intermediate reviewing something. At a more advanced level, when you do this, you can actually then have the students set up little stations where they are looking and helping support the grammar of a writing task. So it's almost like a little the students can take their writing and move to these different parts of the classroom as students are the expert team on that particular aspect of writing. So you can see how this can get moved into lots of different levels and be a very fun way to engage students with these charts and activities. Another way that I think is really nice is this having the students, especially if it's something that's been introduced, maybe it's you're teaching the beginning of a low intermediate class, or you're teaching the beginning semester of a high intermediate class, or an advanced class, then students are reviewing often at the very beginning. And so in this case, I think it's very nice to have the students have the rules side, because most grammar charts are going to have rules on one side, like we saw, and the examples on the other side. So in this case, I would make a copy of the rules side, or maybe if you have a projector thing, you could just project it onto the front of the classroom so that all the students can see it. And then in order to have students realize grammar is more than something that's just taught in this class that I have to take, have students look at readings that they're doing. Or if it's an abridging program, have them look at textbooks from their other classes. Or even inside your IEP, you could have them look at textbooks, maybe from the writing class or the reading class or the listening class, or even have students look at their own writing. And so have them find the examples for the rules. And this really helps reinforce the idea that grammar is not an isolated skill, but one that's central to language use. And I think all of us who have taught grammar, it's just something that we practice, and sometimes because of what the material we're using or whatever, we get a message from the writing teacher that I don't know what you're doing in grammar class, but your students don't know how to use past tense, or your students aren't clear on how to have subjects and verbs agree. So I think that this would be a really nice example where the students are finding the examples, then you can look at the examples that were presented in the textbook. So I think this is a really nice way to help avoid some of that sort of decontextualized grammar instruction. And it also engages the students. They're finding the examples. They're having to look. They're having to think. How can I find this? So moving on with that same idea of avoiding grammar silos, which I think is something that it's really common to have this notion of now I'm doing reading, now I'm doing writing, now I'm doing listening, speaking, or maybe you're fortunate enough to be in a program that has content-based or theme-based instruction. Even there, we need to make sure that our students are getting the grammar that they need to deal with all these different tasks. So how can we integrate some activities in our grammar classes that encourage grammar in context? Well, one is being aware of the different types of writing tasks that our students have to do. So again, this is thinking about cause and effect writing. When we do a cause and effect task, we know that from research that, and all of my examples are coming from the grammar series by Cambridge that I was the lead author on, of Grammar and Beyond. So, but you can use these with all of these activities could be used with any grammar series or in any grammar or writing or reading class. But we know from research that in cause and effect writing, cause, reason, and factor are three very common nouns that are going to be used. And so we want to make sure that our students control those nouns, that they're not surprised when they see them. And then we also want to help our students understand and be familiar with the adjectives that frequently go with these three nouns. And that's not to say, you might be saying, oh, but there are other adjectives that could go with those nouns too. That's true. There are many other adjectives that can go with these nouns. But we know from having done extensive research that these adjectives that are being presented here with cause or reason or factor are very, very frequent. And so, you see things like leading cause, underlying cause, major cause, the main reason, the major reason. Those just sort of roll off your tongue, and all of you are fluent users of English. And so therefore, when you're reading this, your eyes just slide across them because you've had so much input and so much practice with this. But our students haven't. And so it's really, really nice to give them these tools so that as they read, they're at least aware of the frequent vocabulary and vocabulary grammar relationships that they'll be seeing as they tackle this important task of doing a cause and effect writing or any kind of informational writing. We can also look at reporting verbs. This is one of my favorite things because as we look at this list, we see that one of the most common reporting verbs is say, and the second most common reporting verb is show. I don't know about your students, but I certainly have experienced that most of my students like those two verbs. They are very common, and they're sometimes the only verbs that we see used for reporting in our students' essays and papers. And it's nice to give them some variety and help them understand there are other verbs that can serve that same function. Now, as we look at these verbs, we can see that, as this says here, most of these are followed by that. So we can see, a recent government report suggests that obesity is a problem for all ages. We can see the researchers argue that blah, 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 or the scientists explain that blah, blah, blah. So we can see these reporting verbs, but let's think of an activity here where we can actually get some practice doing something that helps us raise awareness about these reporting verbs. So taking 3 or 4 different short texts, you as the teacher would know how long the texts that your students would be able to read and do this activity with. So you take 3 or 4 different texts or passages. These could be from a reading textbook. It might be from your grammar textbook if it has an introductory text at the beginning of the unit. So the students are all going to have different texts. Not all, there'll be, let's say you have a class of 12, there'll be 3 students with the same text, three groups with the same text. And so then you ask the students to scan the text, and you might have a list of reporting, you would have a list of reporting verbs on the front board, or maybe the students have it from their textbook, and they scan. So in this case, they're practicing a reading strategy in the grammar class, and then they're writing and making a list of the reporting verbs. Now remember, each student has different texts, so then you pair students to compare the reporting verbs that they found in their text, so they're talking to each other. Maybe you can do this pair share thing where you pair the students, they compare their list, they compile a list, then they pair again with another set of students that had different texts, and you continue to grow this list of reporting verbs. You see the variety that's being expressed or the lack of variety, and you can talk about that. And then you list this, you create this list of reporting verbs. Maybe it's exactly the same as the ones you've taught your students, or maybe there's some new ones. But this is a nice way to, sort of talk about language and language use. And then you can definitely do this activity where you look at what's the word after the reporting verb. And if you're looking at mostly informational texts, if your passages were mostly informational, you're going to see that in informational writing, most of the words that come after a reporting verb, the most common word is that, because it's forming actually technically a verb complement clause. But your students don't need to know that language. They just need to be aware that if they're, someone says, if you're in conversation, you might say, Mary said today is Tuesday. But if it was, or Mary said today it's going to rain. And then if you were reading a weather report, it would likely say, the weather report says that it will rain. So that is much more common in written language. So this is another example of talking about the difference between speech and writing and helping students understand that sometimes we use the same verbs, but we use them in different ways. So hopefully this gave you some ideas with fun activities with reporting verbs. And so then I think another part of grammar, and this is close to the end of what we're going to be looking at, is editing. So we often ask our students to edit their own writing. And, I don't know about you, but for me, it's really hard to edit my own writing, and as a learner of a different language, it's really hard, right? Because you struggled so hard to make that piece of writing, and then all of a sudden you're supposed to go back and fix it. Well, I thought I did it great the first time, so what am I going to fix? Well, here's some ideas of activities that might help you go back and fix those things. So one thing we can do is we can help our learners be aware of frequent or common mistakes that all learners face. And for those of us who have been teaching for a long time or working with a particular language group, we know what errors are going to be typical. But as we change language groups, or as we have a group of lots of different learners, or maybe we're a new teacher, we may not be as aware. So if we have this list of common mistakes, it's not because we want to teach the mistakes, but we want to help our students realize, hey, watch out for these things. It's kind of like a detour in the road, right? You get the warning sign, watch out, this lane's closed, move to the other lane. So here it's like, watch out, watch what we can do here with these count, non-count nouns. And then giving your students a text where it has some mistakes. Now, they didn't write this text, so it's easier. It's much easier to go through and find mistakes. So here this text has one mistake marked, and there are 8 more. And so you can check this out when you see the replay if you look at the recording of the webinar. But believe me, these are the mistakes. These are the other 8 mistakes. And so you can, whoops, I want to go back for a second. So you could actually have the students just look for this, or you could have, as a class, created a little checklist from these 5 mistakes so that you have that next to there, like a writing, editing checklist. And you can do this with any type of structure that you're teaching. But the point is, we're not staying at the level of a sentence. We're going on and we're helping students see how language is used. And so this will be our last activity that we look at, and it's called Writing Wrongs. And this is sort of a play on words, and if writing and writing, WRITING, was there, I tried to figure out how to get both words in there, but it didn't work out so well. So many of us will start our classes, our writing classes, or sometimes our grammar classes, with something on the board that is a pattern that we're noticing, and we might put up a sentence or a little excerpt and have the students, when they come in, look at that and fix it. Well, that's fun, but it can kind of get monotonous. And so here's a way to breathe some life into that activity. So give students pieces of papers that have different sentences or expressions that have errors. So they might have lots of different, maybe you've finished grading papers, or you're realizing that students are going to be encountering some of these common errors. So you have these excerpts and on little slips of paper, and you pass them out to your students. So there's lots of different texts out there with errors. And then you ask the students to correct the error. So they're doing this much like the activity when they would be correcting the error that's on the board. But once they've corrected the errors, here's where the fun begins. They wad up that piece of paper and throw it somewhere in the classroom. They're getting rid of their errors. They're throwing them away. And so then you have students scramble around, get the wadded up papers, make sure they don't get the same error that they had corrected. And then they can work as pairs, or this could be a teacher-fronted activity, reviewing the errors and the corrections to make sure that the students have done the appropriate correction, and also to discuss or explain anything that might have been confusing. So this is a nice way. So say, it's kind of, you have the grammar class right after lunch. Every now and then, this could be a nice way to kind of revive so that your students don't look like that first slide we looked at of rote learning. We don't want them falling asleep. So to wrap up, I think it's this quote from Leonardo da Vinci is just great. Knowing is not enough. We must apply. Being willing is not enough. We must do. So we really, really need to have our students actively engaged in practice and not just rotely marching through our classes and not seeing the connection between grammar and how central that is to all of the communicative purposes that we have for using language. So I hope that you've gotten some good ideas for engaging practice with vocabulary, with charts, and a lot of different ideas, hopefully, for using grammar in context. So I think that I really appreciate your time, and I hope this has been useful and you've gotten some good ideas. All of my examples came from these two series. One that you may have seen before, Grammar and Beyond, a 4-level series that's, I think, pretty nice, but I'm prejudiced. I was the lead author on all of these. And now we have a new series that just was launched called Grammar and Beyond Essentials that has a very, very nice look. And if you're going to TESOL, I encourage you to look at the booth, at the Cambridge booth. And now I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have or that have come through. And I thank you very much for taking time out of your busy schedules to be part of this presentation.
Thanks, Randy. It looks like there's a couple questions that we picked out of the group. But before I throw the questions at you, I'm going to drag over this the certificate of attendance. Now you should be able to download the certificate of attendance. Just click on the file name and click download files, and you'll be able to download that. Thanks again for everybody who attended. We really appreciate your enthusiasm. A lot of good stuff in the chat box.
Okay, and a lot of people seem to be asking if this is going to be available to them. So maybe you can talk about that.
So the PowerPoints that we do for any of our webinars are not available. Those are the property of the presenters, so we don't share those. But what we will do is all the webinars that we do, have done in the past, and are doing this week for our webinar week will be recorded. And we're going to post them on the website once they're recorded so you can rewatch them. Excuse me. So one of the first questions I saw come up is, let me see what we have here. Scroll too much. Are there any technological tool that can be used to analyze frequently occurring vocabularies?
Yeah, so you could actually take readings from your classes and or a reading activity that you're about to do with your students, and you could use you can use a software that's free called AntConc. I'm going to type it in the chat box, and it's easy to use. It's free, and that can give you frequency lists of whatever you've put in. If you put in readings or conversation or student writing even. So that's a really nice. It's available. If you just Google AntConc, you'd find it, and that can also give you chunks of language. So there's also a website called, let's see, word info that's based on the academic word list that was developed by Mark Davies and Dee Gardner. And that site has a really nice interface, and then you're not having to deal with entering texts and trying to figure out how to use a new software. It's very intuitive, and this site is free. Word and phrase is free. It will never ask you to pay, unlike Coca does sometimes. I also see that somebody asked about inductive versus deductive grammar instruction, and I think both are important. I think that certain learning styles of our students are more conducive to one or the other, but I think having students be involved in deductive grammar analysis can be really useful, where the students are problem solving, and it's, you want to vary your instruction, so you're not always going to be doing vocabulary tic tac toe, or you're not always going to be having students try to figure out something. So hopefully, you'll do some presentation and some practice, and then you'll also have some more deductive activities.
Hey.
And then someone asked if they could use, oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, no, I was going to read the question, but you're more than welcome to.
Oh, okay. I'll try to do that. Someone asked if they were as an online teacher, could she use Grammar and Beyond, or he used Grammar and Beyond with my students? Of course you could. There's an online version. Someone also asked the difference between Grammar and Beyond Essentials. So Grammar and Beyond Essentials is essentially a refresh of Grammar and Beyond, so it looks much snazzier. Some of the readings have been tweaked and updated. Some of the things that we wanted to revise a little bit are revised, and it does not have any writing. So it's, in a sense, it's the first 4 parts of each of the units of Grammar and Beyond without the writing activities, but there is writing available online. And Kyoko or Drew can even give you more details if you ask them questions. Someone asked, let's see, wait a minute. I'm trying to, let's see. So if somebody, Drew or Kyoko, if you see a question that you think I should answer while I'm reading through this scrolling thing.
Could you expand on how to use charts with large classes or even odd or uneven number of students?
Oh, sure, sure. So using the charts, you can, as you cut up the chart, obviously, I mean, yeah, there are very few of us that have an even number of students in every class, right? So it might be that as the students, like for looking at this example of the charts, wait, go back. Wait, I'll go back. Oops. So we look at this one. So if I were using this and I had a class where I had 11 students, I would have to make 2 copies of this chart. And there might be a group of 2 students in some cases being the experts on that chart, in that part of the chart. And there might be others where there are groups of 3. And that's fine. You just have them be a little pod. With more advanced students, it's even better to have 3 students or 4 students with the same area of expertise, because then you can send them around the classroom to work with students in groups of 2. Does that help or make sense? I hope so. If you try it, you'll see it's easy. It really is fun, and it's a very engaging activity for students, and it's a fun way rather than just going through the chart again. Can I suggest some, one question is, could I suggest some activities to stop students from translating sentences or trying to translate every sentence into their native language? Well, that's hard, right? I mean, especially at a beginning level, that's when it's the most common that this happens. But all you can do is help students say, you know, let's try to just do this in English, and let's try to make it work, and just try to. It just takes practice, and it takes building confidence in your vocabulary resources. So maybe realizing, oh, my students really aren't confident with these structures. Let's practice them some more in a good way. Let's do some role playing. Let's provide some written support for my students so that they feel more confident. They can have some notes, so that helps them do if it's a writing activity or if it's a speaking activity, they can have, you know, some practice with that in different ways with different pairs. I hope that helps. So I think that we're probably close to wrapping up. Are we, Drew? Yoko?
Yes, unless there are any more questions. I didn't see any come through on the group chat. Any practical tips?
So one last question that I saw was a recommendation for finding texts with errors. Well, one recommendation is, if you've been teaching, you probably have essays from previous classes, and you can anonymize them and use those as a resource. And then Grammar and Beyond, Grammar and Beyond has at the end of each unit, a section on common mistakes that's based on research that I've done with a corpus of learner texts. So that's a great resource. Oh, and I see Kyoko wrote that. Kyoko wrote that also. So I want to say thank you again for taking the time in all the different time zones that we're in. And I hope that you have some ideas that you can use in your class later today or tomorrow. Thank you very much.